Yeah, just like running over.
Connect with respect.
I have no idea. Sitting right here or
No, it won't be on you hardly ever.
I just suddenly realised what's sitting there might mean. I got into this really interesting conversation.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along. My name is Michael Christie. I'm from here at the Northern Institute. And I'd like to welcome you to this very special event to which we have all been very much looking forward to, when we have three of our favourite people who have been long associated with the university and with this particular area, who are going to give 3 talks on 3 days, all around the notion of objects and governance and governmentalities and changing ways of understanding where we are and who we are up here in Northern Australia and beyond. So it's all part of the Northern Institute People Policy in Place, and we stretch up from here around. So thank you for people from Real coming along too. That's really good to see. I've been known Helen for 30 years or so. We've worked together in East Arnhem Land with Yolngu people, looking at curriculum and developing ways of working different knowledge practices together in school education. And since then, Helen's been hanging around at the University of Melbourne, but coming up here often to talk to us and to work with us, to help us with our writing and our thinking. She's here for a couple of weeks working with a whole lot of different projects that we're working on, just helping us to think through what we're doing. We've been having a workshop for today and tomorrow looking at writing about objects of governance, but Helen has actually prepared a particular talk for today about her angle on objects of governance as our familiars, and we're recording this for the Northern Institute, so I hope you don't mind having your faces flashed over every now and then. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Helen and ask you to talk for maybe 3/4 of an hour or so, and then there could be questions and comments.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming. As Michael said, it is very exciting to be part of a triptych, you might say. And I'm going to start off by thinking about objects of governance as familiars. And I'm going to do so by really focusing on a particular poster or a particular page of a particular report. And this is a report that was published by the Centre for Policy Design, which is a fairly recently established left-leaning think tank. It's been, as you'll see, very influential in the last few years in promoting policy development for the Labor administration. It's about to go into the wilderness, probably. So in 2011, it published a report, Stocking Up, Securing Our Marine Economy. And in 2013, with remarkable economy of speed and little fuss, it was enacted as policy as Australia's new system of marine parks and reserves. So this, the report adopts what is in fisheries governance and research still a slightly new or a new paradigm called ecosystems approach to fisheries. Of course, it has its acronym, EAF. And this new paradigm of governance, as it's often seen as, was really authorised or launched by the UN in 2002. So it's been around a while, but it really, I was in South Africa recently and they were all talking about EAF and amazingly identifying Perth as the place from which EAF is launched to the world. The report proposed a policy which expands participatory governance, in other words, recognising stakeholders who have an interest in Australia's marine estate, and bringing everyone inside the tent. These are all slightly dated, the metaphors of governance, of participatory governance these days. But in addition to participatory governance, that governance should have more government. In other words, there should be better policing of zones on the ground. So in other words, more resources, more taxpayers' money used to police these new parks and restricted fishing zones, and more, many more, a much expanded area of total exclusion, and have them better policed as well. So it involves spending a lot more taxpayers' money, you might say. Okay, so this is what it looks like, the marine estate with more zones of exclusion than any other national marine estate. So it sees itself as a world first.
The coloured bits are the exclusions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to focus on a particular page of that report, and it takes the form of a poster, and I think it could be, and I did see it once sort of excised from the report, turned into a poster, and actually on someone's corkboard. So it was designed as a poster, and it actually, I think, embeds the entire report in the argument, and it embeds the entire report as these seven numbers, if you like, or I would actually prefer to call them 7 enumerated entities. However, these 7 numbers embed and express and contain the entire argument of this report. And I'm going to suggest that in this poster we see a bestiary of objects of governance. Now, I'll come back to the inhabitants or the members of that bestiary. Let me just say a little about bestiaries. What's a bestiary? A bestiary vocabulum is a compendium of beasts, and it was actually made popular in Europe's so-called Middle Ages in illustrated volumes, and many of these illustrated volumes are held in various repositories around Europe, and I'm sure the same in Australian museums as well. And this is a sort of Christian version of Aristotelianism. Aristotelianism, of course, you'll remember Aristotle and Plato disagreed with each other about the location of universals. They were entirely convinced that universals exist. Plato, and there's this famous image of Plato pointing like this and Aristotle doing like this. For Plato, universal forms are descend into objects from ideal forms. For Aristotle, universals are found in particulars, and they are the essence of things. So this sounds a bit trivial when it's put that way, but it's actually quite a profound different, or the difference is in the relation between the general and the particular. And so they imply different forms of generalisation, they imply different forms of knowledge practices. So they're actually much more significant in terms of everyday life than at first it seems, or particularly when you look at two white guys in togas, one doing this and one doing this. So here are some examples. They're beautifully done. And the idea in the bestiary is that each of these animals, with its essence, is a particular and unique moral entity. So many of them are very beautiful, weird and wonderful beasts, but also plants and rocks. And so it was not only animals. Okay, so bestiaries, collections of these entities with essential being, were in a way the official, express an ontology that's of the officialdom of the Middle Ages. These are found in churches very often, and this ontology has multiple objects, each a unique moral entity. And it assumes a singular domain of symbolic meaning. In other words, what really matters is this essential symbolic meaning that's in every unique entity. Okay, now familiars were a particular set of these entities, and they were companions of witches, and they were supporters of interventions for good or evil. And we get the evil stories of witches, but in places where witches still exist, for example in South Africa, as I just mentioned, I was recently, witches can use their familiars, or not, to intervene for good and ill. So it's a simplification to think of witches or wise persons as using their familiars like black cats, or hares or toads, warty toads and so on, purely for malevolent purposes. So in in suggesting that objects of governance are familiars, I'm reaching back to a past that had a different ontology. Now, it's not that I want to mobilise that ontology. I want to recognise that past as a source of inspiration. That it lurks there, still vibrant, and it can be a source of inspiration when we seem to have come to the end of some sort of tether in doing modernity. So it's not that I want to rediscover or disinter Aristotelianism, not at all. But I want to remind you that we have that ontology embedded in our traditions. Okay, now bestiaries and their inhabitants with their multiple objects were largely eclipsed several hundred years ago in a world where ontological singularity began to reign and spatiotemporal objects became the real world. And so for a few hundred years in this real world out there, objects and words became cleaved in an Aristotelian framework, in a bestiary. Objects and their names are ineluctably together. They're not separate, they're one and the same thing. And the essence and the name and the entity is all one. In modernity, words get separated off from spatiotemporal objects out there, and we have words as representations and meaning, symbolic meaning over here. And there's this very strong sense of words as somehow floating above the lumpy, bumpy world, and there are various sky hooks coming down and connecting lumps of reality to means of representing them, and of course maps and reports and so on. There's a huge number of these representations, but just one world. So words became just another means of technique, another form of technology. This is a beautiful rendering, a beautiful representation of technologies of representation. It's a bit hard to show words apart from showing words. And of course it was, this notion of representation was deeply embedded in the work of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon published what many people think of as the ultimate account of the scientific method in Novum Organum Scientiarum. Just a long time since I did that. And this is part 2 of what was seen as a 6-part project. 6 parts, of course, being the parts that God took to make the world. So Bacon was in articulating 6 science as 6 parts was doing a bit better than God, perhaps, although doing God's work as well, of course. So, the quick trot through a history of epistemology, and I'm suggesting that we're now entering a new era of epistemic multiplicity. What does that mean? That spatiotemporal objects and their representations are not going to go away, just as Aristotelian objects never entirely went away in modernity. Yet I think new sorts of entities are emerging, and I don't think we've got a good story about them yet. So, in a way, for quite a few years now, I've been trying to get onto a better story, tell a story about what's happening now, and really, it's a form of naming, but not naming in thinking of it as a representation, not at all. My attempt to name is an intervention, because for me, names and entities, although I recognise that many people can have objects over here and names over there, that's a considerable accomplishment, and I don't think the work that has to be done to keep names over here and things over there is really worth doing. I think we have to get to know a different way where names and things are one and the same, and they and in naming them we're doing a form of intervention, a form of participation. Okay, so bestiaries are beginning to re-emerge, and so when I saw this poster, I thought, aha, it's a bestiary. I bet not many people. Okay, now in trying to name this, what's emerging and complicating our epistemic landscape, I'm actually inspired by what I've learned from my Aboriginal instructors and friends for the last 30 years, as Michael said. He and I have been working together with our former friends in North East Arnhem Land. And in that time, Michael and I have been subject to a number of object lessons, which were painful for both those who delivered the object lessons and we who were subject of and to them. So I'm inspired by what I learned painfully and was taught painfully. I'm proposing a radically rerouted bestiary, one which has its roots in the Australian land, you might say, and inspired by this Yolngu bestiary, not that that word features in any way in a Yolngu ontology. It's a different origin story, and the origin story is of ancestors undertaking journeys, spirit ancestors undertaking journeys, constituting people and place and words, people, place and languages as an ineluctably whole entity. People, place and words come together. They were brought into place by ancestors in guinea bags who spilled out the people, the languages, and through their actions, only part of these actions was spilling the people and the words, constituted places as points, if you like, as points of agency in an otherwise non-agential world. So points of agency, sacred sites, they're called in contemporary parlance, were constituted people, place and words as one and the same. And I've illustrated this with a page from one of the where does this? I don't actually know.
It comes from a Gulta Rom workshop book. So they had a workshop at a place called Yalambara, where the old people came along and told stories about the origins of this particular group and all their connections to different people and to different places. So it was a workshop held by the school at Yokala. And this was the book that came out of it.
So this is one of those workshops. It's actually I grabbed. It's a very poor image. I've just grabbed a still from a video. We have videos of these workshops, and you see a young woman, a student, lying down contributing to a map of people, place, and words. And this is the map. And this was one part of our curriculum. This was the part called Jalgary, and it instructs and inducts younger children into the richness of multiple people, places, languages, and in doing so, of course, enables the child to understand exactly how he or she is related to that people, place, language. Okay, so it's a very nice one of people, words, and the implication is, and all those words actually speak of a very particular place. So that's a placed person and words. But this is, these are illustrating an alternative ontology, and this alternative ontology is, among other things, I want to learn to think about words and things and bodies in new sorts of ways. Okay? I want to understand words as okay, so I want to understand words as extensions of bodies. Now, say this to a linguist, they're liable to take fright or laugh. Everybody knows that words come out of minds, and that the children, as they grow, they do certain things with their bodies, and then eventually they start using words, and that shows their minds have kicked in. This is a very strong story about learning, the child as a learner. So, inspired by my younger friends, I want to, or I did actually, come up with a different story about the origins of words. And it was, I needed to have a different story about origins of words when I was writing about writing about Yoruba numbers. So this is in work I did some time ago. And so I made this argument that just as children emerge as bodies in relation to what we think of as reality, their muscles gradually strengthen, and so they get to make gestures and movements as part of that being a body in place. what's the difference, I argued, between the gesture of a vocal cord and the gesture of a finger or an arm or a body or a leg. Okay. Seeing utterances as emerging as children become embodied in place. Of course, you can do that relatively easily with respect to children's naming and pointing, but what happens when it comes to predication? Well, it is actually possible, and this is extending a later Wittgensteinian argument, it is actually possible to see predication and designation, in other words, having a subject in a sentence and a verb in a sentence, as an expression of embodiment. Okay, I'm not going to go through that argument now. It's a very painstaking and difficult argument. But this is my origin story, if you like, for the ways in which words and objects emerge both together and separately. Children learn to do objects in particular ways. They learn to turn around the wheels of a tricycle by pushing pedals up and down. And it's quite an amazing accomplishment when you see a child achieve it. That's a particular form of ordering. They do another form of ordering with a much finer sort of gesture, using words. And some of them discover words quite early and realise that you can order adults around with words. It's amazing as it sounds. I want to go back to this baby human as an inspiration for my understanding of collectives. Now, collectives take us away from baby humans learning to ride tricycles and order adults around, we're starting to get into forms of ordering that we as academics do. But I want to suggest that the form of collectivity that we're actually doing in this room is not separate from that work that I was doing a very, very long time ago, as I learned to push pedals up and down and make a tricycle go around in the hilly backyard in Sydney, and the not very effective for many years ways of ordering adults around. So there's a continuum in that embodied work. And I see it as very much inspired by my experience working with normal thinkers. I would never have been able to think those sorts of things if I had not been painstakingly instructed by young elders, many of whom are dead now. So, taking this as all background, you can see that I'm trying to think about the sorts of objects that are here displayed in this poster. This poster is designed to intervene. It's designed to speak quickly to Australian public servants because they don't have much time. And so it lines up quite different sorts of objects. The first, I'm not going to talk about all these numbers because we would be here for a very long time. I'm just going to talk about three. I'm going to talk about the 25 billion, the Australian at the top. I'm going to talk about the second 42% of the list, and I'm going to talk about the 15%. because I think those numbers are actually expressing, or they are forms of three radically different, ontologically different entities. Okay, and I'm going to start with the familiar one, the 15%. 15% is the decline in the rate of growth of long-lived corals in the Great Barrier Reef. Okay, now 15% corals grew at I've forgotten the numbers and I haven't got my piece of paper. But corals grew at 1-point-something centimetres per year between 1909 and 1970. That's an average. Then they stopped measuring for a bit, but when they started measuring again, they found the next 15 years they grew much more slowly than they had previously grown. Okay? So this is an entity. This entity is the growth of long-lived corals on the barrier reef. There's a set of practices in which this entity is constituted. The growth of long-lived corals, the growth of particular, specific long-lived corals in a particular place in the barrier reef. And these entities are constituted by practices of putting down quadrats and measuring bits of coral with a tape measure. That's where they start. There's various other things, but this is clearly a spatiotemporal entity. It's a complicated form, a spatiotemporal entity. It's a fairly familiar sort of modern object. And part of the story is that we've got the corals over here and we've got the number over here as a representation. So this is clearly a modern fact number. Okay, 42%, this is the second of the 42%. It is the projected increase in the value of production from sustainably managed fisheries in 20 years' time if international fish stocks collapse. So, this is a mournful number, and this is the, if you like, this is the core argument for the new system of parks and reserves. And it's an argument about, well, our fish will be worth 42% more because everybody else's will have gone. So it's not 42%. The projected increase in the value of production from sustainably managed Australian fisheries in 20 years' time. Okay, it's a future. So clearly it cannot be a spatiotemporal entity because it's an unknowable future. But it presents itself as a truth claim and it seems very much like the 15%, the 15% decline in the growth rate of long-lived corals in the barrier reef, which is clearly a spatiotemporal entity. This can't be a spatiotemporal entity. It's about something that is projected to happen in the future. It's actually it's rather a complex number. As a percentage, it's a ratio, of course, and it's a ratio of the value of a spatiotemporal entity. In other words, the value of Australia's fisheries, the values of products produced in Australia's fisheries up until 2010. And then it's got another number. Okay? And the other number, the number about the future, is 42% more than the spatiotemporal, the value of the spatiotemporal entity. So you see, we've got a spatiotemporal entity that's valued, and then we've got a future entity that is valued. The future entity has been valued by the working of a model. Okay? It's a model that works in a computer. It's been assiduously designed and fed, if you like, with data about the present and extremely complicated. Okay? So it's not only not a spatiotemporal entity, but it's a number that's emerged from what Brian Rothman calls counting on non-Euclidean fingers. So we've got a number that emerged from counting on Euclidean fingers, that of the value of the spatiotemporal entity, and we've got a number that's emerged from counting on non-Euclidean fingers, which is a model which articulates the future. And I'm using articulate as a in a partial. Well, I'm really emphasising the partiality of articulation there. So this is, if you like, I think the core entity in this document. These numbers that emerge from counting on non-Euclidean fingers are very, very common these days. We haven't got a name for them ontologically, and I think the sooner we get a name for them, the better. And the sooner we understand how these entities both connect with and separate from the entities that can be counted on Euclidean fingers, the better off we'll be. We're not there yet. Okay, this is my image of this number. This happens to be a set of models that are a set of practices that are emerging from relating the length of fishes. So you can see everybody measuring the length of fishes and the outcome as graphs done by men wearing white shoes. From the fisheries. And the map is the various fisheries. So I'm not sure how to name this entity, but I know that there's some of the things that are inside it. Okay. Now, this 25 billion, it's another sort of an entity. Now, the 25 billion is the estimated annual production value of marine ecosystem services, and it's the value that marine ecosystem services contribute to the Australian economy. 25 billion. Now this is ecosystem services are a very hard entity to get hold of. They're not quite these entities that emerge from working with non-Euclidean relations. If you track them down, I'm slightly allergic to ecosystem services, I might say, but nevertheless, I'm like a person who is allergic to cats, but is married to someone who loves cats. I try to live with them and get to know them and do the best I can. ecosystem services, I haven't tracked down marine ecosystem services, but I'm actually trying to get to the core of the practices that constitute biodiversity as an ecosystem services. And in 2008, there was an experiment in Corangamite, which is fairly close to where I live, and they came up with a similar sort of unimaginable number. I can't imagine what 25 billion is, but a similar number. And at the core of this number, that provision of ecosystem services in the Corangamite Shire annually had provided to the Australian economy was something like 1.28 billion. And at the core of it were landowners planting trees, putting up fences, and generally doing what we think of as conservation work, filling in erosion channels and so on. So it was, and this work by farmers had actually been bought as a product by the Victorian government as ecosystem services. So the Victorian government had purchased ecosystem services from farmers and in an auction. So the farmers had participated in an auction, competing against their neighbours to provide ecosystem services to the government. Whereas, and this auction, the product in the end was farmers planting trees, building fences, filling in ditches on their own land. And probably the farmers' grandfathers had cut down the trees that caused the erosion gullies, etc. So, at the core of ecosystem services is some sort of an auction of a product that has been constituted usually out of labour in some way. So they're extremely difficult to actually get a handle on what sort of entities they are. They're very vague on one hand. They've got this very precise core of an auction, and the government can. The government, of course, wants to buy the best value product, so it wants to get the most ecosystem services for the lowest amount of money, and so it's actually a very precise number that emerges in this auction. But then after the auction, things necessarily become very vague again. So it's rather like it's managing a completely different paradox to the paradox that spatiotemporal entity numbers are managing. The problem with a spatiotemporal entity is is getting from the particular to the universal, okay, and how to manage, it's called the indexicality paradox. So for the 15% and the 42%, the problem for epistemic practices is managing the indexical paradox. The problem for this number and this entity is managing a completely different paradox called the Sorites paradox. And this is the heap paradox. And it's about managing this transition between vagueness and precision. And so this is an entity, this is an enumerated entity that emerges from a particular set of practices that people have invented in the last 15 years that is a series of practices that manage this well-known Socrates paradox. How you start with something vague and work and make it into something precise. And this particular number has a vagueness, a precision, and then a vagueness. So it's actually a double management of this Socrates paradox. So this is even a newer sort of entity in our bestiary that, again, we don't have a name for. So, and this is the way of that this is presented, and the words, the oceans provide food security through protein from wild-caught fishes and aquaculture, recreational opportunities through fishing, diving and swimming, shoreline protection from storms and flooding, which is how the ocean provides shoreline protection. Marine resources, particularly seagrasses and mangroves, sequester carbon. The oceans also provide for biodiversity and other services such as fossil fuels and transportation. Okay, so these are, to actually imagine this number, you've got to imagine a whole, you've got a vague whole, ecosystem services, and it's got all these many parts, and all those parts are very different. All those parts are constituted by very different sets of practices. So this is inevitably a vague whole. It must be a vague whole, and even its parts. Food security through protein from wild-caught fisheries. This is a pretty vague part. So this is doing a quite different form of generalisation, a quite different form of working with universals and particulars, and it's not as influential as the numbers like the 42%, but it is influential. It clearly doesn't index anything. There's nothing there for it to index. So you could call it a unicorn number. We know all about unicorns, but all of the things that we do with unicorns don't index anything. So this is a bit like a unicorn entity. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that the government policy that had us declaring a new system of reserves and parks and exclusion zones in our fisheries is an intervention. It's the sort of interventions that are strongly promoted in government these days, except this one brings with it the added costs of policing, which is quite problematic because the most favourite interventions are those where you go in, rearrange something and then go out again as government. So the new system of marine parks and reserves is an intervention, a government intervention, an expression of contemporary governmentality, and it is effected, or it's an intervention that is enabled by these entities that go along with both doing that intervention and maintaining it. So I'm suggesting that these new entities are familiars. They're the familiars of in the interventions of government these days. And it makes me think of government these days as far more something like people remembered when I was in Nigeria, working in Nigeria, when they used to talk of the days of indirect rule. Indirect rule was a form of governance that the British devised so that they installed, or they used or installed particular chiefs and particular polities, indigenous polities with their entities to do governance. So it became a sort of tiered government. Now I've begun thinking about contemporary governmentality as much more like indirect rule, but instead of using indigenous polities, governments these days use these newly complicated and newly elaborated entities. So it's a form of indirect rule through entities that are becoming increasingly multiple. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Questions or comments? Ben?
I have two questions. Thank you for that talk. That was lovely. It's really interesting to hear what you're working with right now. I have two questions. One is more a desire probably for you to reflect on a particular thing. And the second is more like a question. The first has to do with origins. Throughout the talk, the desire on your part to find both within what we would call kind of classic Western metaphysics an alternative origin story, right? That then would go side by side. It wouldn't account for or displace, but it would be in conversation, I think, with another set of origin stories with different ontology, that is, Yomo, etc. And I really like that. It's like, well, you can find it here and you can find it here. That is, you don't have to always go, otherwise you can go within to another metaphysics or something like that. So I love that. But I have a question, it's a question that's a real question I think about, which is, how do we think about this notion of an origin? And in particular, since it's your field of philosophy, there's a quite important that at least folks I know around here and then another metaphysics in the West, that an origin story might not begin with nothing and then have to get to one, but rather there's already a lot of ones around, and this is part of the oneing that's happening. That is, it's part of the multiplicity, to use a certain kind of language. And with the Yomo story or other stories, or accounts, stories is wrong, other accounts, it's not like in the beginning there was nothing, in the kind of Christian ontology, but there was already a lot, and here's how in that allotness, these kinds of agential forces came. So it seems to me, maybe, and this is more of the first question, which is kind of just thinking together, how do we remind ourselves that an origin is not an origin, is not an origin, but we have to really, and I think you of course know that. And so how do we put pressure on origin? The second has to do, really, it's more like a push on. This one is more like, wow, I'm with you, how do we do this a little more? The second is more of a push, which is, these kinds of objects that you're talking about, especially that second one, sounds like a certain kind of statistical object, a certain kind of epistemic object that someone like Hacking Foucault would say had emerged at a specific moment as a governmental technique. That is, that which combines a virtual object manufactured around probability and its technologies. That is indexically linked to an existing object so that you feel the thing that's real, yes, and then you get tricked by this really weird elaborate technology of probability of this object in various kinds of futures, which is a brilliant, when you looked at the 15%, it's just brilliant and chilling. But my pressure toward you is simply, how new is this? If you look at the arguments that these kinds of techniques emerge, we can worry about dating a little bit, but emerge as a central kind of technique of governance, I don't know, depending what you think, like 19th century. So what's the newness of this?
Yeah.
And I don't disagree, there might be something new here, but what is it?
So is it just an indexical object of governmentality dressed up in a new way, a new, more elaborate set of techniques? And that, of course, is the way most people treat these objects. There's a lot of writing about models and how they're, and all sorts of ways in which people are saying, well, they're not really different. They're just, I come along and say, it might be a good idea to think of these objects as really different entities. I think one of the reasons I want to think of them as different entities, which is not to say that they're also not the same, is because of this third class of entities. And I'm increasingly I'm wondering how much of that modelling number is actually about managing the Socrates paradox. I think it's all about managing the Socrates paradox, and you don't see that until you see the other number that is all about managing the Socrates paradox. So I haven't made the argument there because I haven't found the evidence. But so I think that 42%, which presents as a fairly harmless fairly ordinary modern fact number that manages the indexicality paradox, and that's by means of a very familiar, what I call a three-step epistemic, an epistemic quick step, an epistemic three-step, which involves ordering, valuing, and then using the value to identify or to authorize the initial ordering. So there's an ordering step, a valuing step, a reordering step which authorizes the initial contingent ordering step. And everybody knows how to do that. And so to meet a number that looks the same, it is familiar. But I'm thinking that the weird part of this number is actually weirder than, I think we've been trying to domesticate it by saying, oh, it's just a cat with five ears, whereas it's not a cat.
And I agree with that. I'm just wondering, did this cat, this assemblage, or the relationship between what you're calling the spatio-temporal syntextual problem and the heat problem, is that what is, it's the three-step, and the relation between the three, what you see as new when you said we're at the end of the modernity's tether, or have those three, the problem of the heap, the problem of the index, and spatio-temporal, been with us for a long time, but we're able to see, maybe in seeing them, they fall apart.
Yes, I think they've always been there.
Yeah.
So I think that's right.
Yeah.
But I think these new sorts of objects haven't been doing much heavy lifting of late, and now they do a lot more of the heavy lifting.
And does that explain your slight allergy to environmental services? That it looks like there's some bad faith in there, but you can't quite sniff it out.
Yes.
And how do we do the work of finding the bad faith?
In one case it was relatively easy because a person promoted it as a value, as an index, announcing it was an index, when it was perfectly clear from the text of the paper that it was clear that it was not an index, and that the author knew that it was not an index. So that I thought was he was marketing, and he says he was marketing that number.
So that's not the process of it becoming a familiar, which is the wrong step. It's the nature of the familiar, what's done with it.
Yes.
That's the good witches, bad witches.
Yes.
Is it just that we're becoming less and less, or more and more immune to being hoodwinked? It's sort of like a return to the sort of the black magic status in our politics, where words are allowed to say things that once upon a time a person could never say. It's like scientists are now allowed to say things that once upon a time would be obviously just nonsense.
I think one of the things we can't say is, well, that's the way nature is. In other words, it's that self-evident natural order is much harder to maintain as a self-evident natural order. But I don't think that's about not being hoodwinked. I think recognising the constitution of the natural order involves more work and a different sort of work than it did in the past.
Okay.
I'm curious to just know the success of this poster. I mean, is that in terms of actually how people are reading it, how people are, if it's out in the landscape, people are looking at it and thinking about it. Have you talked to anyone about their responses to the poster itself, or these?
Well, I mean, in a way, the intervention of which the poster was part was extremely successful. A year after it was published, it was being drafted as legislation. I don't think that's either because of the persuasiveness of the report or the persuasiveness of the poster. I think it's much more to do with the way government think tanks and governments work and so on. So this was an intervention of which the report and the poster were just parts of a much larger intervention that was clearly ramified very widely for things to move that fast. But if you who's that poster designed to speak to? It's actually designed to speak to busy public servants sitting at their desks. And whether it worked, whether it did any work, I don't know. But it was surprising to find it in this report, series report, and as for this 25 billion, how? I mean, does that persuade anybody? I think that's the most unpersuasive entity. It just reminds me of a group of people assembling on Bondi Beach saying, Australian society owes a debt of 25 billion to the ocean, because that's what that number means. If the ocean has contributed 25 billion to the Australian economy last year, well, the implication is we're in debt, 25 billion. When are we going to pay? When are we going to give back the ocean? It's 25 billion. That's a number like 99% that the Occupy movement use. So it's a speech act in a way, not an argument. So the answer is I don't know, but when you show that poster to people, they say, "Oh, you've got to." It's the only way you get an argument through these days. You've got to have everything. You've got to speak the language of economy. Economists just rule everything, so we've just got to put everything in economist terms. So that's how that poster was explained away.
Yeah, but it's not actually telling anybody anything, really.
No.
And just in reading through the document, are there other numbers in there that are like? It seems to me the most peculiar set of numbers to choose in a way, to try and do whatever work it's trying to do. Is there what other kinds of numbers are in the report, or is that the sort of?
Well, it's. I mean, the report has these. To get a government policy, it's always good to find a gap. Okay, so you've got to delineate a gap, and when you've got a gap, that's very useful. Okay, so you have to the gap here, the gap that this report discovers, is a gap between the value of the marine estate and the amount that is actually put into securing that marine estate. So that there's all these sorts of, there's a gap. And so the numbers that are in the report actually bring that gap to light. And so the new marine system of reserves, marine reserves, plug the gap.
Yeah, that last one there, the 60% of who believe that up to 30% of waters off metropolitan zones should be protected.
You are very beautiful, I say.
It's an amazing, yeah.
What does it say? What does it say?
The 60% is the proportion of frequent fishers who believe that up to 30% of the waters of metropolitan Perth should be protected.
Big deal.
But there's votes in that one. There's votes in that one. So that's another
It's basically saying that the fishermen are behind us.
Yes.
Yeah. But it has a poetic
The thing is, if you've been to 30,
and of course it was done in a telephone survey. It was a Mickey Mouse telephone survey.
I really liked the way that you tied together the ontology of a Ural space and paralleled it with the kind of thing that's happening, and peopled this space with a bunch of odd birds not yet named. In the Ural world, those people who are in charge of spirit familiars, the Mangit and the Gadaman and the clever people, had I'll have to say that correctly, a bestiary of various familiars that they used to create powerful interventions within the society, and those kinds of powers were then moderated by other authorities in the society, in our society, and this collection of new forms of bringing belief and making powerful acts. It doesn't have the same kind of possibilities for those people upon whom these powerful acts are being perpetrated to be able to control the outcomes of them.
Yes.
So naming those rare birds would be a powerful act.
Yeah, the beginning of getting to know them, and when you get to know them, you can work with them better.
I was very interested when you mentioned earlier about going into the elder community, and that it was a very painful experience for you. And from my view, you said it was a quite painful experience.
Ontologically painful.
Could you explain that a little bit?
I was actually accused once of being addicted to that ontological pain in much the same way that runners are addicted to the pain of running. But it was something that I experienced first when I lived for 8 years in Nigeria, of having the categories by which I lived my life and constituted enough certainty to go on dissolve beneath me, dissolve within me, and to leave me stranded and not knowing what to do, yet required to act because I was in positions of authority. And I found that very painful, having to act in the absence of being able to think.
And the potential of doing a lot of damage
Yes.
by just doing something, from your old categories.
And I would imagine that it has led to a lot of expansion. So,
Yes, yeah, and I was trained as a natural scientist. That was my first training. So when I met numbers in Nigerian classrooms, there were unlike any numbers I'd met, but everybody else in the classroom knew how to work these numbers. That was very painful. And I was the teacher, educator, training the teacher, training the children, who clearly were, for whom these odd numbers were very familiar, and they could do things beautifully, elegantly, and things that, just I could admire, I could see what was being done, but I had no idea how they were being done.
And see, this is where the older philosophical, the word and object thing, where I think you're actually putting a really interesting pressure on it, but only if you get rid of the word and the object and instead look at math, because it's where the mathematical sciences have come to present a way of having essence that the other sciences use pressure on. So when you said, well, actually it's hard to set in natural sciences to talk about essence anymore, part of my little brain said, well, in some ways, but in other ways, if you go to the mathematical sciences, oh, absolutely, you can still physics, higher physics, mathematical, the math as this kind of weird, interesting object that has been able to escape the problem of correlationality, and thus why economics likes to ape or mimic the mathematics. But then it's a very different word-object problem. And that's what I have to say, what I see so interesting here. And when you touched on the kind of philosophical ground that you're staying on a little bit late, Wittgenstein, the American pragmatists, where, 1 + 1 might not equal 2 in a certain place or at a certain time, right? That intervention here is, and through Nigeria, through others, in which something very interesting and more fundamental in terms of the break could happen. But numbers versus words. I think words have been infected by right, our existence versus essences, but numbers haven't.
That's right. Numbers are still
seen
as having non-human origins.
Yeah, totally. And a kind of a generalization that's universal and timeless.
Yes.
They're the timeless object.
So this is why numbers do. I mean, I stick to numbers. I tend to follow numbers. And when I see a number like what I call Costanza's number, I tend to get very jerky.
Yeah. I like that.
Okay, so time to move on. One more question. Comment?
I like the idea of the temporal, spatial, and those dimensions that you mentioned when it comes to meaning management. There is this guy, he's famous, and he's in neuroscience and biologist. I have no idea what his surname because it was never relevant to my life. probably started with W. And he came up with this theory how actually we got the brain. So unless we actually move through space and time, we don't need a brain. And there's a creature he found that has a brain in its early stages of its life. It's some sort of amoeba of sorts. But the moment it becomes sedentary, like actually plants itself on some rock or somewhere, it actually eats its own brain, digests its own brain, and becomes a plant. Because it no longer needs to manage the space and time. It actually doesn't need a brain anymore.
What is the name of this guy? I can't believe it.
It's a very famous case,
E.O.
actually.
Wilson?
It's a very famous case, and you can actually go on top TED Talks, and I've heard of him. There was this brain series on American television. I can't remember the guy who was actually running it. But I just look for it. And the original brains.
Brains as emergent.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I needed for
and digestive
time and space.
I wanted to digest my brain.
Okay, look, let's call it a day for that one. Just don't forget, tomorrow Tess is going to be along here talking about another series of familiars, her own familiars, as she struggles with how to write about her life in Darwin and the Northern Territory and what it's made up of and how to interpret it. So I think we're going to have familiars all over again from another angle. That's tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Thank you for coming, and thank you very much, Helen. Helen will be here. See you all tomorrow. Help yourself to a biscuit or a cup of tea on the way out if you'd like one.